In the first two videos, and I recommend you go to the playlist, we talked about the early tribes where everybody was equal and women procured most of the food and took care of the children, and she had the power of menstruation. She started to be seen as the goddess, and it was a matriarchal society where the man was just uh, used by her for her sexual pleasure, and she was in charge. This lasted for maybe 25,000 years and ended around 500 BC. That's when man started be saying, like, hey, we have power too. And it was through their penis, through their phallus. But then the penis is not a really good way to control women, especially because the penis deflates and becomes useless and it's not powerful enough. So where did man go next? To God the Father. And this is where I think we are really, really stuck, because all the religions still refer to God the Father. And I could go into a whole separate thing on that. But when we say God the Father, if God is everything, then he must also be a mother. If he's just God the Father, how can he be everything? It was a creation by man who sought to exert his control over women by using his phallus wasn't enough. And again, I want to say that in this book, in the history of the world, she talks about the relation between men and women, but we are neglecting the fact that most men were also suppressed in these religions and in these political systems and so on. So I do not want to say that all men had power over all women, but in general, femininity and womanhood was denounced, and was denounced for much of recent history, but maybe not all, because in the tribal days we were all equal. Then we had 25,000 years of the goddess, which ended in 500 BC, and now we've had 1,500 or 2,000 years of man as God the Father and man as the supreme lord over women, where the woman is just a vessel for the man's penis. And now in society, we're seeing like a shift back to women in the knowledge economy, women of equal economic power of man, and the sexual revolution. And it's causing a lot of discomfort among men because now they feel really lost. But also the social media age is causing problems for everyone. So we're just in another age, and just to see that there are different ages that we go through is what I really like about this book. And for us to realize that a lot of these power structures are just things that we fabricated in how we lived in our societies at the time. So now let's go into God the Father. Blessed art thou, O Lord, our King. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, that thou hast not made me a woman. Daily prayer of Hebrew males. The birth of a man who thinks he is God is nothing new. Turkish proverb. In the beginning was the Word, declared St. John, and the Word was God. In fact, the Word was a lie. In the beginning, God was not. But as history unfolded in different nations and at different times, it became necessary to invent him. Because early people did not talk about a God or one God. They had many gods, or they had spirits and so on. For the assumption of divinity and power from a purely physical base had certain crucial limitations. Remember in the last chapter we talked about the age of the phallus. The human penis, even when inflated to magical religious status, falls short of godhead. Additionally, with the discovery of agriculture and the consolidation of tribes into townships, human societies became increasingly sophisticated, requiring structures, systems, and administration. Once survival was assured, surplus became property, and man awoke to the glory of being Lord and Master. To secure ownership and protect rights of inheritance in a more complex society called for something subtler than the indiscriminate deployment of man's bluntest instrument, of his penis. Achieving power, man reached out for the secret of control. And as he began to look beyond the end of his penis, he found a stronger Lord, a greater master, God. Male divinity, of course, was nothing new. Isis had her Osiris, and Demeter had been forced to bow to the vengeance of the Lord of the underworld. The new gods of power were equally aggressive to the old gods and rapacious. The difference was that now each one insisted that he alone was God. He was the one God, the only God, and no one else could play. From the unknown moment in history when the secret of birth became known, women were doomed to decline from their goddess-like eminence. But man's self-elevation to a god did more than cut a woman down to normal size. It succeeded in subordinating her to a lower form of being. Each in its own way, the 5 major belief systems of Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, and Islam, by their very nature, insisted on the inferiority of women and demanded their subjection to values and imperatives devised to promote the supremacy of man. Now, it's interesting that this came about because it wasn't the religious founders who did this. It was men who did this later through the patriarchy, because all the religious founders taught the love of women. Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and other prophets of the cause, in fact, taught the love of women. Muhammad said that Allah said that women were the greatest gift of God to man. And women were not barred from the spiritual fruits of the new faith. Buddha laid down the doctrine that women, just as much as men, could destroy the 5 fetters of sinful humanity and achieve enlightenment, etc., etc. So the key to the gross inflictions laid on women in their name lies in the nature of the system itself, because of monotheism. Monotheism is the idea that there's one God. It's not a religion, it's a relation of power. Monotheism is a relation of power. Any one God idea has a built-in notion of primacy and supremacy. That one God is God above all others, and his adherents are supreme over all non-believers. Whereas in a multiple pantheon, all jostle for primacy. Even the king of the immortals, Zeus himself, could be challenged or outwitted by his angry wife or jealous sons. The ancient world rejoiced in a plethora of such myths and beliefs whose gods, goddesses, and godless were widely tolerated by rulers throughout Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, Rome, and Greece. But patriarchy changed all that. So there was this age, especially in Greek mythology, there were so many gods. In India, there still are so many gods. Like there are so many gods. But monotheism was about one God, and the patriarchy had a genuine belief in the one God who had the inescapable with an inescapable duty to enforce this belief upon all others, with the claim to a patent on truth. Came for the first time ideas of orthodoxy, habits of bigotry, and the practice of persecution. Any opponents of the born-again zealots were to be destroyed without mercy. As a power relation, then, monotheism inevitably creates a hierarchy of one God over others, of stronger over weaker, of believer over non-believer. In addition, the new concept of personal relationship between man and his God, since God had chosen to create him in his own image, led to the idea of the Father God as vested in every human patriarch. Under patriarchy, patriarchal monotheism, womanhood was a life sentence of second-order existence. For women could never recover from one primal, overwhelming disability. She was not male. The ensuing syllogism represented a triumph of masculine logic. If God was male and woman was not male, then whatever God was, woman was not. St. Augustine spelled it out. For woman is not the image of God, whereas the man alone is the image of God. Man could progress to become each his own pater familias, while women remained trapped in their perpetual inferiority. I guess Muhammad went along with this too. In the end, men are in charge because Allah has made one to exceed the other, so good women are obedient, guarding in secret that which Allah has guarded. So, under the Father God, only man attains full adult freedom and control. Woman in diametric contrast is sentenced to a double subordination, to God and to man. As St. Paul instructed the Corinthians, because man is the image of glory. I'm sorry, you guys. Man is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. As this shows, male supremacy does more than imply female inferiority. It demands it. How then was that demand brought home to each and every woman? The first step had to be the eradication of all traces of women's previous superiority. This meant a wholesale onslaught on the worship of the mother goddess, on her devotees, and by extension on women's right to rule or command. Christianity, no less than Judaism, declared from the outset that the great goddess, whom Asia and all the world worshipeth, must be persecuted and all her magnificence destroyed. Acts 19:27. The women resisted, of course, but it was still going on. In his dealings with the mother goddess and her worshippers, Muhammad was content with nothing less than the historical liquidation of the female element. So they got rid of all the evidence of the goddesses. That's what they tried to do and did. Then we have the Adam and Eve myth, which I guess some people think actually is true, but all these early Bible stories, I went to church, when I was a young mom, we went to church for a little while, and this Methodist church where we went, we actually read these books about where, like, you can be a believer, you can be a Christian, but you don't have to believe everything. And also that a lot of the stories in the Bible, like the whale swallowing someone, these are the same story in the virgin birth. These are stories found in all the major religions, and that a lot of the stories in the text were like mythology stories. So it doesn't mean that they actually happened. They were symbolisms of something that we can learn from. But this idea of Adam and Eve is, also like a mythology. I don't know exactly where it came from, but it's propaganda. A lot of these religious stories, like who decided that God was a father? Men. And it worked. And it's still working now. So let me continue with the book. The Adam and Eve myth, probably the single most effective piece of enemy propaganda in the long history of the sex war, had other crucial implications. It performed the essential task of putting man first in the scheme of things. For in all the Father God religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, God creates man first. Woman is born after man, framed of an insignificant and expendable lump of his bony gristle. taken out of him like a child from its mother. Essentially, this is just one of the countless attempts of womb-envious men to usurp women's power of birth. With a swift piece of patriarchal prestidigitation, God reverses biology and stands nature on its head with the birth of his man-child and defines of evolution, where men and women evolve together, and of life itself, where woman gives birth to man. God now assumed the power of all new life. All the monotheisms taught that God alone created and breathed life into each fetus, using the woman in whom he lodged it simply as an envelope in the Islamic phrase. Yet still the fathers of the early religions were not done with downgrading women. Alongside this notion of women's inferior status flourished a conviction of women's inherent and inescapable inferiority. Woman, once sacred for a mysterious power of life, is now reduced to nothing more than an obliging uterus. Once the mother of all, she is now a mere container. And the great goddess, she of the thousand lovers, is forced to present an obliging orifice to every conscientious cock. Yet by a bizarre limiting paradox, the emphasis on women's duty of procreation carries no connotations of female sexuality. As women were denied any full part in the process of reproduction, so they were likewise denied any pleasure of participation in the act. In fact, the less they knew about sex, the better, decreed their fathers and keepers. And thus, in another reversal of the old mother-centered ways of thought, the highest value shifted from adult womanhood and the price of fecundity to maiden ignorance. Now the child bride, the unspoiled female, not yet woman, became the finest type. And a small film of atavistic membrane, the hymen, casually deposited by evolution in the recess of every woman's body, was discovered to be her prized possession. Virginity came in with a vengeance, as every budding patriarch suddenly realized his divine right to a vacuum-sealed, factory-fresh vagina with built-in hymenal gift wrapping and purity guarantee. So powerful was this fetish of virginity that a new ideal gathered momentum, that of preserving it in perpetuity. One early Christian father, St. Jerome, was active in persuading fathers to dedicate their daughters to nunneries at birth, while another, St. Martin of Tours, constantly compared the pure, ungraced field of virginity to the field of marriage torn up by the pigs and cattle of fornication. As this shows, the Christian church had from its origins a particular problem with women's sexuality. Odo of Cluny wrote in the 12th century, "To embrace a woman is to embrace a sack of manure." The sack of manure metaphor for women's bodies was an obsession with the early Christians. Yet Christ was born of woman. The solution to this embarrassment was found only after protracted doctrinal councils, when the gruesome hilarity of debating how the divine seed could penetrate the virgin's hymen, or how Christ could have emerged from her uterus without rupturing the said hymen with the sacred infant head, appears to have gone unnoticed. But one thing was clear: our Lord, the Son of God, the Redeemer of man, could not have been born from a sack of shit. The Christian fathers had to protect Mary's purity in order to protect his. The Blessed Virgin Mary, it was decreed, remained a virgin not only before the birth of Christ, but afterward as well. She was unravaged by the bloody mess and pain of childbirth. He was hermetically sealed off from any contact with her filthy and disgusting innards. Nor was this merely a Christian perversion. The compulsive drive of the patriarch not simply to occupy and possess a pure and unspotted vagina, but also to emerge from one, may be demonstrated from the fact that in addition to Jesus, Buddha, Plato, Quetzalcoatl, Montezuma, and Genghis Khan all claim to be virgin born, with womanhood reduced to its most immature aspect. Man therefore saddled himself with the problem of her regulation and control. What this boils down to in every case is a withdrawal of the previous freedoms of adult women, which then traps them in a permanently arrested state of adolescent dependency, and as such fulfills all the prescriptions of the patriarch. Where previously the mother had chosen freely her many lovers, now throughout all of India and China, as well as the lands under the sway of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the woman became a passive participant, chosen by her husband, given in marriage by her male guardian. So women no longer had any choice in marriage. They were denied security within marriage because they were owned by the man, or they also had to be in a polygamous marriage. They were forced to live within the marriage. They were victimized by the patriarchal laws, and they were deprived of humanity. The new father gods who rose in the East during the crucial millennium spanning the birth of Christ were very different from their phallic predecessors, though no less equipped with mindless aggression and manic drive. Now God was no longer in the thunder or far away in the clouds, veiling the peak of the distant mountain range. He was in every male authority figure, from priest to judge and king. He was in every woman's father, brother, and uncle. He was in her husband, so he was at her board and in her bed. Finally, and most importantly of all, he was in her head. And I might have skipped over this part where explaining that because God is a father and man is made in the image of God, man is godlike and woman is inferior. And so every man is the image of God and every woman has to be subservient to every man. So, and this was taught in religion, and this is what women were taught, and that's in their heads and in their belief system. And that's a lot of what this polarity relationship is about, and the trad wife movement. The man is the leader of the relationship, and he is the strong one, and the woman is the weak, submissive one who has to follow his lead and ask his permission. And God's always watching you masturbate. But I'm going off topic. The gods of the patriarchs tightened their grip only slowly, and the gap between what the authorities prescribed and what human beings actually did allowed women of skill and resource more room to maneuver than the historical record has often been prepared to show. But women's resistance henceforth was to be localized, sporadic, and all too frequently short-lived. Viciously attacked for and through their breasts, their hips and thighs, and above all for their insatiable cunts, all too many women were lost beyond all hope of recovery. And now we go into the sins of the mothers. An Arab proverb: 3 things are insatiable: the desert, the grave, and a woman's cunt. Buddha: the body of a woman is filthy and not a vessel for the law. Now, man wanted woman to be subordinate to him, right? So now, in this section called The Sins of the Mothers, she talks about how men had to convince women that they were inferior. Since women are not inferior, how did man convince women that they are inferior? And now again, we have to remember throughout history that the elites, the oligarchs, the kings, also made most men inferior, that most men were slaves and struggling and poor. So we're not talking about that here. Here we're talking specifically about the relationships between men and women. Well, I want to acknowledge that most humans were oppressed by the ruling classes and the struggle for survival and poverty, and that it was only the last 60 years since the gold standard was eliminated and we had fiat money that we saw a huge rise in prosperity, which at some point will have to collapse as well, as all structures collapse and change, you know. But let's go on to how did they induce, because men, the question really is here about women's bodies. Why did women's bodies become such a crucial battleground in the sex war? The answer to this lies at the heart of the masculine struggle for supremacy. By denoting women as separate, different, inferior, and rightly subordinate, men made women the first and largest outgroup in the history of the race. But they live with women. The males of the dominant culture have to allow them into their homes, kitchens, and beds. Control at these close quarters can be maintained only by inducing women to consent to their own downgrading. Since women are not inferior, they had to be bombarded with a massive literature of religious, social, biological, and more recently, psychological ideology to insist that women are secondary to men. And to make women believe that they are inferior, what better subject for this literature of religious teaching, cautionary folk tales, jokes, and customs than the female body? By destroying the basic site of human confidence and sense of self, by dumping in sexual guilt and physical disgust, men could ensure women's insecurity and dependence. Women were told that they were dangerous in every part of their anatomy from top to toe. Luxuriant hair could excite lust, according to the Jewish Talmud. From 600 onward, allowed a man to divorce a wife who appeared in public with her hair uncovered. The female face was another Venus's flytrap for helpless males. The Semitic obsession with the gagging of women had emerged as early as the Jewish law of Moses at the birth of Judaism. Quote, women are to remain silent. The violent medieval denunciation of Arab womanhood. Women are demons and were born as such. No one can trust them, as is known to all. They only think of getting some member in erection. Arab literature is shot through with this paranoid fear of women's insatiable cunt. The Arab word for the female genitals is al-farj, slit, device, crack, an opening that may look small but into which a man could disappear without trace. This rabid dread of the voracious vagina reached epidemic proportions among the Arab nations and can hardly have been allayed by the Islamic institution of polygamy. There is an inherent conflict between the notion of the insatiable woman and the demand that she be satisfied with only a quarter of a husband. Are men really the stronger sex? These centuries of strenuous myth-making, in fact, reveal the very opposite, the atavistic fear of the weakness that women caused in men but never had to share. For in sex, while women bloom, men wilt. Man enters the vagina hard, erect, at the height of his potency. He emerges drained, drooping, spent. Women, by contrast, are the recipients of man's potency, his essence, his best self. The vagina, therefore, is the source and center of incessantly renewed energy, the penis fallible, inadequate, and finite. Man, giving his all, was unmanned by woman and could not summon his manhood again at will. Small wonder, then, that he should hate and fear the creature who robbed him of a power that none of his gods of power could restore. Nor was this all that a man risked in the arms of the rapacious woman crack. To penetrate the place of devils, to feed the animal between a woman's legs, was to jeopardize not merely body but soul too. Hardening into certainty, then into religious orthodoxy during this time, was the hysterical preoccupation with women's bodies as sources of pollution, infecting and contaminating men. And that had to do with menstruation. In terms of understanding the patriarchal struggle for control of women's bodies, the issue of blood is a major preoccupation. For not only did women bleed every month from girlhood for all of their adult lives, every stage of their journey as women, every passage from one state to the next, menarche, defloration, childbirth, was also marked by the flow of blood with its frighteningly ambivalent signal of both life and death. The greater the danger, the stronger the taboo. So from the introduction of the one-god religions down to the 20th century, the handling of a virgin's first sex experience, for example, focused only on the vagina as a place of devils, never on the owner of it. The organ was seen as most dangerous when first penetrated. The task accordingly was to protect the man, who in rupturing a woman's hymen plunged this most vulnerable part into what Leviticus called the fountain of her blood. So then there was enforced marriage, then we had child brides, bride sales, genital control, where they bound women to keep them from being able to be sexual, female genital mutilation, which still goes on in some parts of the world. Next came the age of learning, which, women, it was said that women were too emotional to learn. Since our brains are smaller than men's brains, it was said that women were not as smart as men, we were intellectually inferior, that we should not learn, it would damage us, that we were just too stupid to learn. And also that there were no economic advantages in educating women since they could never earn a living by their brains. And there was every economic disadvantage since an educated woman could so easily price herself out of the marriage market. Isn't that what we're seeing today? So a lot of women are experiencing today. They have priced themselves out of the marriage market because they're too smart. So that ends part 2 of the book. Again, this would be my playlist.